In the 1990s, there was a significant change in the investigation of child murders in Canada. The presumption of innocence was no longer the primary focus, and instead there was an increasing emphasis on adopting a more suspicious investigative lens, known as think dirty. The increasing tendency of law enforcement to automatically assume that every child murder case involves sexual assault would cause investigators and medical staff to develop tunnel vision. This narrow perspective led them to concentrate on the evidence that confirmed their preconceived ideas and consequently disregard their common sense. During this dark period in Canadian law enforcement, numerous wrongful convictions occurred, leading to shattered lives, broken families, and injustices that were challenging for all parties to come to terms with. One of these such cases would be that of William Mullins-Johnson, a native man from Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, Canada, who in 1993 was convicted of first-degree murder and spent more than 12 years in jail, not just for a crime he didn't commit, but for a crime that never happened. The flawed mindset of investigators and the flawed work of medical professionals both led to his wrongful conviction. Moreover, one of the medical professionals involved imagined a crime, further contributing to William's tragic outcome. William Mullins-Johnson, also known as Billy, was seen as different by friends and family. He stood out at 12 years old due to his large 6-foot stature. Additionally, he went partially blind and deaf at 3.5 months from brain swelling, which potentially impacted his development. According to his mother, Lorena, friends and family may have easily believed Billy could be a killer because in their minds, he was perceived as different. In 1993, Billy was 22 and lived with his brother Paul, along with Paul's wife Kim and their 3 kids. Billy and Paul had a very close relationship growing up. They always looked out for one another, and such was proven true when Billy was released from jail following a 15-month stint for armed robbery and needed a place to stay while he rebuilt his life. Billy would often babysit the kids, and according to Kim, the kids loved staying with him. On June 26, 1993, Paul and Kim asked Billy if he could babysit so that they could attend a ball game later that evening. And being the doting uncle that he was, he quickly agreed. While sitting on the couch watching TV, Valen, Billy's niece, who was 4 at the time, fell asleep early. It wasn't anything overly concerning because she had been running a fever earlier in the day, and so Billy just chalked it up to that. And then at 7:30 p.m., Valen gave her Uncle Billy a kiss and a hug goodnight and went upstairs to her bed. Approximately a half an hour later, Billy put the other 2 kids to bed, and when he checked on Valen, she was sleeping. The next morning, on June 27, 1993, Billy was woken up by the screams coming out of Kim as she ran barreling down the stairs. Billy asked Kim, "What's wrong?" And to his horror, Kim shouted out that Valen was dead. When Kim entered Valen's room that morning, she first noticed the vomit on the bed, and when she turned little Valen's body over, she was purple. Paul immediately tried to resuscitate Valen, but it would prove to be impossible. Sadly, Valen's body was already in a state of rigor mortis. Valen's body was taken to Sault Ste. Marie General Hospital for an autopsy, and the findings would have catastrophic implications for Billy and his family. At 6:30 p.m. that same day, Billy was arrested and taken to the station for questioning. What exactly did that autopsy find that would lead to such a quick arrest? Well, let's first start with what Dr. Bhupendra Razaya, the lead doctor for the autopsy, found. I'm going to call him Dr. BR from here on out because Dr. Bhupendra Razaya might become a bit of a tongue twister. So, Dr. BR would quickly conclude that Valen had died between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m., placing her in the sole care of Billy at the time of her death. He also stated that there were bruises on her thighs and vagina, and so he ordered a sexual assault kit. Dr. Biard then contacted 2 more doctors who both had experience in sexual abuse. One of the doctors he consulted with by phone stated that it sounded like chronic sexual abuse, and the other doctor, who had no experience in pathology, went even further, calling it the worst case of anal penetration that she had ever seen. Dr. Biard would inform police that Valen suffocated from a force applied to her chest, and also that she had been sexually assaulted for months. The family were shocked upon hearing this information. They originally thought that Valen died from choking on her vomit, and now they were being told that Valen had been murdered as well as sexually abused for months. Paul, Valen's dad, was immediately struck with guilt. How could this be happening to his little girl without him knowing? At the station, the police would try to coerce a confession from Billy, but he wouldn't budge on his innocence. He loved that little girl. He loved all the kids and maintained that he would never hurt any of them. Police went on to tell him that they had a pubic hair and they would prove it to be his, but still Bill vehemently denied any wrongdoing. So they went one step further, telling Bill that they had even semen from Valen's body. But Billy wouldn't budge. He refused to plead guilty to something he didn't do. Billy would shout out his innocence to anyone that would listen. Fast forward to Billy's trial in September 1994. The prosecution called a witness that took the autopsy findings even further than the other 3 doctors did. His name? Dr. Charles Smith. A renowned expert witness in many child death cases at the time, despite having absolutely no forensic pathology experience, took the stand and without hesitation declared that Valen was not only sexually assaulted for months and murdered, but instead was strangled or smothered while she was being anally raped. The defense argued that there wasn't any physical evidence connecting Billy to the alleged crime. There wasn't any bodily fluids or DNA from Billy found on Valen's pajamas, and likewise no DNA or fluids found from Valen on Billy's clothing. And the pubic hair that police threatened to connect to Billy wasn't even human. One would think that this would be enough to place reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors, but it wasn't. Dr. Smith's testimony was so convincing that without any physical evidence whatsoever, a jury would come back after just 6 hours of deliberation and found Billy guilty of first-degree murder on September 21st, 1994. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with no chance of parole for 25 years. Billy was transported to Joyceville Institution just outside of Kingston, Ontario, and with the convicted sex offender title, he was immediately threatened by other inmates upon arrival and was rightfully afraid that they might slit his throat, and therefore placed in a 4-month solitary confinement for his protection. In 1995, Billy was taken to Warkworth Institution, just north of Toronto, Ontario, which offered protective custody to sex offenders. While there, Billy would take some correspondence courses to learn about his Aboriginal heritage. On December 19, 1996, the Ontario Court of Appeal would deny Billy's appeal. However, one of the judges, Justice Stephen Borens, would disagree with the other 2 judges, stating that he would have ordered a new trial because there was no evidence ever connecting Bill to sexually abusing Valen, and of the 5 experts who testified, it was only Dr. Smith who thought he saw evidence of recent anal penetration. And also, there was never any motive established. On June 18, 1998, when all of Billy's appeals had been turned down, he wrote to the Association in Defense of the Wrongfully Convicted, AIDWIC is what I'm going to call it, asking for help. He wrote, I honestly believe I will not win this fight all by myself. I'm asking for help because nobody is going to listen to a native convict convicted of murder with sexual overtones in the case. Billy succeeded in his plea for help. AIDWIC, which is now known as Innocence Canada, agreed to take his case. In February 2003, lawyers from AIDWIC wrote to the Crown's office on behalf of Innocence Canada, asking that the samples taken from Vallin's body be made available so that they could be independently reviewed by forensic pathologist Dr. Bernard Knight. When the police contacted Dr. BR to retrieve the slides, his records showed that he sent them to Dr. Charles Smith, who never sent them back. Dr. Smith would deny knowing the whereabouts of the slides and would stonewall the process for approximately a year before a raid of his office found them on his desk in 2005. They were then provided to Dr. Michael Pollinen, who at the time was Chief Forensic Pathologist for Ontario. Dr. Pollinen decided he wanted to do his own investigation into his slides, and his findings would prove what Billy and his mother knew all along, that he was innocent. During Dr. Pollinen's investigation, he would discover that the findings of Dr. BR and Dr. Smith were just plain wrong. There wasn't an ounce of evidence that Vallin was ever sexually assaulted, nor any evidence that she died of anything but natural causes. Dr. Pollinen would go on to explain that the enlarged anus that the other doctors thought to be conclusive of sexual abuse was actually a natural occurrence that results from the relaxing muscles after death. And the bruises around her genital area, as well as the ones on her neck, were just the natural process of blood pooling in those areas. Dr. Pollinen would also reiterate that there was no semen found anywhere on Vallin's PJs, nor any DNA from Vallin found on Bill's clothing. Dr. Pollinen would give a few possible reasons for Vallin's death, one being failure of the muscle tissues of her heart, and another being genetic issues. The results of Dr. Pollinen's findings were sent to Dr. Bernard Knight, the Welsh pathologist, who agreed that Vallin died a sudden, natural death. This new knowledge prompted Billy's lawyers James Lockyer and David Bayliss to prepare a brief to persuade Federal Justice Minister Irwin Coulter to wipe Billy's conviction on the basis that he is the victim of a miscarriage of justice. And on September 7th, 2005, an application for ministerial review was submitted. While waiting for the status of the application, Billy's legal team asked the court to release Billy on bail. He had spent 12 years already behind bars as an innocent man. He didn't deserve to spend any more. Billy's uncle offered up his entire fortune in support of his bail application, stating, "I knew him to be a gentle boy, and I had difficulty accepting that he was capable of killing, never mind one of his young relatives, all of whom he seemed to have a warm and healthy relationship with." On September 11, 2005, they released Billy from prison, a place he should have never been in the first place. And it would take until July 6, 2007 for Federal Minister of Justice to grant Billy's application and send his case back to the Ontario Court of Appeal. The courts would finally see Billy's innocence, stating, "It is now clear that there is no evidence that Vallin Johnson was assaulted or murdered, and no evidence that Billy was guilty of any crime." And on October 15, 2007, Billy was acquitted from a crime that never happened. A few years later, Billy would receive compensation in the amount of $4.25 million for his wrongful conviction. But I wonder, is that enough? Enough for the immense psychological, emotional, and social toll endured by Billy during his wrongful conviction? Is it enough for the shattered relationships, missed opportunities, and the stigma associated with being labeled a child murderer? In Billy's own words in a 2010 interview, he said, "I largely lived the way I lived when I was inside, isolated and untrusting." And just because the courts now declare Billy an innocent man doesn't mean he has escaped the stain of suspicion. In a Fifth Estate documentary, Billy's niece and Valen's sister, Jean, stated that if she had a gun, she would kill him. Going on to say, because people don't just go to prison for nothing. But in this case, someone did. Her uncle and godfather, William Mullins-Johnson. I wanted to conclude with a brief note about Dr. Charles Smith, who I will do a more extensive video on later. His work would undergo an investigation when people started to recognize how many people were in prison on account of his testimony for crimes against children that never happened. He saw foul play in every case he worked on, and those grotesque interpretations of events caused him to lose his medical license. Kent Roach, author of Wrongfully Convicted, hit the nail on the head when he says, when someone starts to think dirty, whether an expert like Smith or a police officer, they have the power to make a crime out of an accident, a natural death, or a suicide. It is no secret that the justice system needs an overhaul when it comes to people who are wrongfully convicted of crimes, real or imagined, and for those who, for whatever reason, decide to plead guilty when in fact they are innocent. The justice system's failings erode public trust and destroy innocent lives. However, we can prevent these injustices by calling for better reforms that enhance the quality of legal representation, the reliability of forensic evidence, the transparency of plea bargaining, and the accountability of prosecutors and police. It is way overdue that we, as a people, demand that our justice system live up to its ideals of fairness and accuracy, so that we can ensure justice is truly served for all.